Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into how recent government policy changes are impacting care systems in Argentina. Our main source for this deep dive is going to be a report from Cocina de los Cuidados. They're a coalition down in Argentina advocating for care-related issues.
And they've been doing some really important work monitoring how these recent policy shifts are actually playing out. It's one thing to talk about economic reform in the abstract, but it's another thing entirely to look at how those decisions trickle down and impact people's everyday lives.
Yeah, that's what I think is so interesting about this report. It gets granular. It really connects those dots.
Yeah.
So let's start with the bigger picture. What's the overall economic situation in Argentina right now, and how does that factor into all of this?
Well, imagine a country grappling with a 72% inflation rate. Now, couple that with a 15% drop in real wages, and you start to get a sense of the challenges many Argentinians are facing. And then add to that equation significant government spending cuts, which are often a hallmark of new administrations trying to get a handle on the economy. Those cuts, they have a ripple effect, and often the first things to feel the squeeze are social programs.
And that brings us to this report from La Cocina de los Cuidados. They've analyzed 47 key care policies and used this really interesting traffic light system to show their status. Green for surviving, yellow for endangered, and red for discontinued.
And the results are pretty alarming. Of those 47 policies, a staggering 24 have been completely discontinued in just 6 months under this new government. That's over half with that red light flashing.
Wow. So let's unpack that a bit. Who is most affected by these policy shifts? The report seems to focus on a few key demographics. One that immediately comes to mind, especially in light of those budget cuts, are children. What are some of the specific challenges that kids and families are facing down there?
Well, for starters, while some cash assistance programs for families are technically still in place, their buying power has been absolutely decimated by that soaring inflation.
Right, because if everything costs more.
Exactly. The money doesn't stretch as far. We're talking basic necessities here. Food, diapers, medicine, everything's been hit by these price increases, making it incredibly difficult for families to keep up.
And it's not just about cash assistance either, is it? The report also talks about the impact on something called in-kind support. Could you explain what that means and how those programs are being affected?
Sure, in-kind support refers to programs that provide direct assistance rather than just cash.
So things like?
Things like food programs that offer meals or vouchers for groceries, or early childhood development initiatives that provide childcare or early education services. These programs are absolutely vital for many families, especially those struggling to make ends meet. But unfortunately, they've been hit hard by these recent cuts.
And we're talking about real consequences here. The report cites a study that found over 10 million children in Argentina are eating less meat and dairy because of financial constraints.
Yeah, that's a staggering statistic and a very worrying trend. When children lack access to those essential nutrients, especially during those critical developmental years, it can have serious long-term impacts on their health and well-being.
Right.
We're talking potential growth delays, weakened immune systems, and a higher risk of chronic illnesses down the line. Sadly, this is something we've seen play out in other countries facing similar economic crises.
It's a stark reminder that these policy decisions have very real human consequences. Now, shifting gears a bit to another age group that's significantly impacted by these policy changes, older adults. What are some of the key concerns the report highlights regarding their well-being?
Well, for many older adults, pensions are a lifeline. But just like we were discussing with cash assistance for families, the value of those pensions has been severely eroded by inflation.
So you're essentially asking seniors to live on a fixed income, while the cost of everything around them is skyrocketing.
Exactly. It's an incredibly stressful and precarious situation for many older Argentinians.
And to make matters worse, the report also mentions that government-funded construction of new housing for seniors has been completely halted.
Right. That's another concerning development. Adequate housing is essential for everyone, but it's especially critical for older adults who may have specific needs or require additional support. Halting construction on these projects leaves many seniors in vulnerable living situations.
And it raises serious questions about the government's commitment to supporting its aging population. So far, we've talked about children and older adults, but the report also delves into the impact of these policy shifts on people with disabilities. What are some of the most pressing concerns for this group?
One major red flag is the proposed deregulation of disability services. Essentially, the government is discussing shifting more control to private insurance and providers.
And what are the implications of that?
Well, while it might sound reasonable on the surface, it often leads to what we call a two-tiered system,
Yeah.
meaning those who can afford it may be able to access high-quality care, But those who can't are often left with very limited options and potentially a lower quality of care. It's a classic example of how privatization can exacerbate existing inequalities.
And it sounds like this isn't just a hypothetical concern. The report suggests there are already real-world consequences being felt right now.
Unfortunately, yes. The report highlights that the agency tasked with supporting people with disabilities has seen layoffs and closures across the country. This, coupled with the lack of progress on crucial legislation and rights for people with disabilities, sends a clear message that their needs are not being prioritized in this push for economic reform.
It's a deeply concerning trend.
It is, and it's one we need to pay close attention to because these kinds of policy changes can have long-lasting impacts.
We've covered how these policy shifts are impacting children, older adults, and people with disabilities. Let's turn our attention to the report's findings on how these changes are affecting women and LGBTQI+ individuals.
Yeah, it's really important to remember that care work, looking after children, the elderly or family members with disabilities often falls disproportionately on women. And then within that, LGBTQI+ individuals often face unique challenges and discrimination when trying to access those support systems.
Right, they're already navigating these systemic barriers.
Exactly. And now you have this shrinking social safety net on top of that.
The report specifically calls out the closure of the Ministry of Women, Gender, and Diversity as a particularly concerning development. That feels very symbolic.
It is symbolic. It's a very deliberate choice by the new administration, and I think it speaks volumes about their priorities. We're not even just talking about budget cuts here. We're talking about dismantling the very infrastructure designed to address gender inequality.
And as if that weren't enough, the report also points to the rollback of programs aimed at combating gender-based violence, which is just incredibly troubling.
It's like they're taking away the safety net and then removing the team that's supposed to help you if you fall.
Exactly. And the report digs even deeper into this idea by looking at the impact on domestic workers, a sector that's largely made up of women. What are some of the challenges they're facing?
Well, domestic work is often precarious, even in the best of times.
Right.
You're talking about low wages, lack of benefits, a high risk of exploitation. Now, with this economic downturn, those challenges are only being amplified. Job losses, reduced hours, and pressure to accept even lower wages are becoming all too common.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So far, we've painted a pretty bleak picture. But amidst all of these challenges, are there any signs of hope? Any glimmers of resilience that the report highlights?
It's easy to get bogged down in all the negative, but the report does emphasize this one really crucial element of resistance, the role of community organizations. They are stepping up in incredible ways to fill the gaps left by these policy changes.
What are some examples of that? What are they actually doing?
Well, you see everything from community kitchens providing meals to mutual aid network and offering various forms of support. You also have advocacy groups working tirelessly to fight for the rights of those most affected.
So it really is a case of communities coming together to support one another when the systems designed to protect them are failing.
It's about grassroots action. It's
Yeah.
about people recognizing the needs within their communities and taking it upon themselves to provide support however they can.
It's really inspiring to see that level of mobilization in the face of such adversity.
It is, and it's not just about immediate relief, though obviously that is critical. It's also about building community power and holding the government accountable.
And speaking of accountability, La Cocina de los Cuidados themselves are a fantastic example of that.
Absolutely. This coalition of academics, activists, social workers, you name it, they are really meticulously tracking these policy changes and their impact.
And they're not just analyzing data in isolation, are they?
No, they're amplifying the voices of those directly affected, raising awareness and advocating for change.
Right. It's about connecting the dots between those policy decisions being made in offices and the very real consequences they have on people's lives.
Exactly. And I think that brings us to a crucial takeaway for everyone, no matter where you live. The situation in Argentina serves as a stark reminder that we can't take these social safety nets for granted.
It's easy to assume those systems will always be there.
Right, but they're not guaranteed. We have to stay vigilant, informed, and engaged in protecting these essential systems that support the most vulnerable members of our societies.
Because ultimately, progress isn't just about economic indicators. It's about the well-being of a nation's people.
Precisely. And that means asking ourselves some tough questions. What trade-offs are we willing to make? Who bears the burden of those choices? And how do we ensure that everyone has the opportunity not just to survive, but to thrive?
It really underscores the point that these social support systems, they're not just some abstract concept. They're lifelines for real people. And I think that's what I find so valuable about this report from La Cocina de los Cuidados. It doesn't try to sugarcoat the situation. It lays bare the very real trade-offs being made in the name of economic reform. And it really compels us to confront the human cost of those decisions.
It does. It's a call to action for all of us because while this report focuses specifically on Argentina, these questions about the balance between economic policy and social well-being are relevant everywhere.
Absolutely. It's a universal struggle in a lot of ways. It makes you wonder, when does the pursuit of economic progress come at too high a price for society's most vulnerable members?
Right. It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. And I think the report does a great job of highlighting the importance of staying informed, engaging in these discussions, and ultimately advocating for policies that prioritize the needs of all citizens, not just a select few.
And speaking of advocacy, the report itself and the work of La Cocina de los Cuidados is a testament to that right. It's about the power of research, of giving a voice to those directly impacted by these policy changes.
It really is. It's a powerful reminder that we can't just sit back and rely on governments or institutions to solve these complex issues. We all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable society.
So as we start to wrap up our deep dive into this report, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners really walk away with today?
Well, I'd say this. Don't let this information just wash over you. Let it spark a conversation. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues. Share this knowledge. Because the more we discuss these issues, the more we understand the connection between economic policies and their impact on people's lives, the better equipped we'll be to advocate for positive change.
It's about recognizing that these challenges, while incredibly daunting, are not insurmountable, and that often it's at the community level where we see the most impactful and innovative solutions emerge.
Absolutely. There's immense power in collective action, in people coming together to support one another and to demand better from their leaders.
This report from La Cocina de los Cuidados has given us a lot to think about. Not just the immediate impacts of these policy shifts in Argentina, but also the potential long-term consequences. It makes you wonder what happens when a generation grows up with less support, fewer opportunities. What are the implications not just for individuals, but for the very fabric of society?
It's a question worth pondering for sure, and not just in the context of Argentina, but within our own communities as well. Because these issues are all interconnected. What happens in one part of the world often has ripple effects elsewhere.
That's a good point. A good place to leave it for our listeners to ponder. We always encourage you to delve deeper into these issues, to stay informed, and to use your voice to advocate for a future where care and well-being are central to the idea of progress. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.